Greetings, everyone. We're just about ready to start at the bottom of the hour. Before we do, we're just going to go through a couple of the instructions for today's program for those of you that may be new to it, have not used Zoom a lot, and just need to know how we are going to operate. So first, just talk about your sign-in. We don't control your profile within Zoom, so depending on how your profile is set up, when you came into the Zoom room today, you may or may not have been asked to enter an email address. It may have already auto-populated you. Depending on how that appears, we may or may not be able to match you for the purposes of giving you credit for today. So if you're not familiar with how your Zoom name appears when you sign in, please give us a message in the chat area and we can confirm that for you. And this will allow us to make sure that we can match you up for the purposes of giving you credit for today's session. We are only able to grant credit for those that we're able to match with your registration itself. Otherwise, it will be void for you. Please, again, check it out with us in the chat area if you do not know how your name appears. Just to review quickly the Zoom webinar interface itself, the whiteboard is where we'll be viewing the presentation today. There's audio controls in the lower right-hand corner if you're using a desktop computer. We'll be using the chat icon as well as the Q&A icon for submitting questions to our speakers. There's also a closed captioning icon, which I will review these in a minute. You have the option to leave this session. Note that if you leave, you can always come back in. You're not barred from the session. And also you're able to alter your screen view as well from full screen or choose gallery view or other views as well in the upper right-hand corner. Again, these are on a PC. It may differ if you're on a mobile device or a phone. Listening on your computer itself, make sure that your computer speakers are turned in or your headphones are plugged in. You can verify your audio settings within Zoom by just using the audio settings option. We have found that there are times when Zoom will overtake the audio on your computer, and even though you think you've adjusted your soundbar on your computer, Zoom will have another take at it, and it may have adjusted it and you're going to have problems listening. So check those audio settings out if you're having any or experiencing any problems with your audio today. Prior to the session, you had the option to download, or for the future, to download the mobile app on your phone or a tablet or mobile device of any type. You also can always join by just using the link of the session in a browser. Telephone numbers were provided in the email confirmation as well as on the website once you signed into your account. If you're listening by phone or you're experiencing any audio problems today and need to dial in to get a clearer phone connection, that's where those numbers can be found. We are providing real-time captioning today in Zoom text as well as stream text. So within Zoom, you will be able to open and you can mouse over the captioning box and move it to anywhere you want. You also can choose a full transcript option by mousing over the CC icon. With stream text, you will need to open a separate browser using the link that was placed in the chat area, and it was also in your email instructions and also posted on the website. This will give you a streaming view of the captioning. If you want to view both captioning and your whiteboard presentation, you will need to resize your screens side by side to be able to do that. This option is different and functions differently on a tablet and a phone. We also are providing a video sign language interpreter today via Spotlight. There will be 2 sign language interpreters. They will be swapping their images. There may be a brief pause or brief interruption in the sign language. You can change your view of the sign language interpreter on desktop or laptop by choosing Swap Video and Shared Screen option from your viewing options menu. Tablet and phone options will differ depending on the device that you're using. This is just a screen that shows you the different options to be able to change your view, to swap between the shared screen and video, or you can also close the video altogether if you want to. You want to hide the video, just close using the little underline symbol in the upper left-hand corner of the video. We will be taking questions today for our presenters. We have sufficient time in the session planned to do that. We also will be addressing the questions that were submitted online. You can submit your questions during any time in the session in the Q&A area. Please do not submit your questions in the chat area. No questions in the chat area will be reviewed by the presenters. You must have your questions in the Q&A area to be seen by your presenters. If you're on the telephone today and you're not connected in the webinar platform itself and still have a question, please email us at webinars@adaconferences.org and we will convey that question to our presenters. Also, please note that today's session is being recorded. Because of the high volume of registration we have for today's session, we're also offering a YouTube streaming link as well. And that information was on the website as well as the Access Board's website for those who are not registered and able to participate today. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, just send a message to us in the chat area or email us at webinars@adaconferences.org. So at this time, we're going to get started with our session.
Hello and welcome to the Accessibility Online webinar series. The monthly series represents a collaborative training program between the ADA National Network and the U.S. Access Board. And we could not provide these webinars without the support of the Great Lakes ADA Center and their knowledgeable staff. The webinar series is the first Thursday of the month. All webinars are recorded and they're placed in our archive section where we have more than 100 archived webinars to view whenever you want to. Additionally, I wanted to remind everyone that there's 15 self-paced webinars that are available in the continuing education credit section of the Accessibility Online website. We hope that you'll take advantage of these self-paced continuing education credit opportunities. Today's webinar is entitled Accessible Signage. Slide 2. My name is Bill Botten, and I serve as the training coordinator for the Access Board, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenters. First, Phil Broad is a technical writer at the U.S. Access Board. His work involves developing and publishing technical guidance on accessibility and inclusive design, including our bulletins covering the ADA and ABA accessibility standards. He assists in our event programs, our policy and rulemaking, website maintenance, and research. He also manages our public affairs program. Next, pictured in the center is Sarah Presley, who serves as an accessibility specialist, providing technical assistance on design standards for accessible buildings and facilities and accessible public rights-of-way. And finally, pictured on the right is Josh Shore, an accessibility specialist working for the Access Board as well. Josh is currently creating the training materials such as the board's guides and animations and online content to help provide a better understanding of the ADA and ABA guidelines for their general audiences. And let me just say that all three of these people, our presenters today, are on the the group or the committee that works on developing our ongoing technical assistance guides. And this presentation is going to highlight the ongoing work that we have on those guides and our upcoming guide on Chapter 7, Accessible Signage. So if I can move on to slide number 3. Slide number 3 pictures several of our recent guides, but also provides the website address for the Access Board. I just wanted to highlight that we've been working on our technical assistance guides now for about 10 years, and we're through Chapter 6 and are available on the Access Board's website for both the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Architectural Barriers Act. Moving into Chapter 7 is the start of the guide on signage. We also have an animation on signage, and it's pictured here on slide number 3 as well. And you can find the board's animations at the bottom of the home page. There's a carousel that you can scroll through that will bring you to all 8 of the different animations that we currently have available. Moving on to slide 4. Today's agenda. First, we're going to talk about required compliance. Then we'll move into tactile signs. We'll cover visual characters. We'll go into greater detail on the international symbols of accessibility, and we'll address some of the questions that you've been providing to us throughout this presentation and that were pre-submitted. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Sarah.
Okay, thank you very much, Bill. And we will move on to the next slide, slide number 5, to talk about required compliance for signs in the ADA. The ADA standards require signs in some situations where not all elements or spaces are accessible. For example, toilet rooms, elevators, or parking spaces. If not all toilet rooms are accessible, there would be some required signage for the ones that are accessible, or required signage to give directions from inaccessible elements to the accessible elements. And signs are required by other codes that are referenced by the ADA standards. And an example of this would be the signage for means of egress. Otherwise, sign requirements in the ADA standards apply only where signs are provided. So for the most part, these requirements apply only where signs are provided. Next slide, slide 6. There are some signs not required to comply, and these include signs that are temporary, that are up for 7 days or less. Building addresses and directories are not required to comply. If you have signs with occupant names or company logos on them, that content is not required to comply. Menus and seat or row designations in assembly areas are not required to comply. And finally, signs in non-public areas of detention or correctional facilities are not required to comply with these requirements that we're going to be discussing. Next slide, slide 7. We'll start with tactile signs. Next slide, slide 8. Signs required to be tactile. And these signs that are required to be tactile are interior and exterior signs that identify permanent rooms and spaces. And this is only where those signs are provided. And the scoping for these is in section 216.2. Required door labels at exit stairways, exit passageways, and exit discharge have some tactile requirements per section 216.4.1. And we won't cover this so much in this webinar, but for elevators, there are required tactile labels for floor levels, car controls, and emergency communication devices. And these requirements are in section 407.2.3.1, 407.2.3.2, 407.4.7.1.1, and 407.4.9. And finally, rail station identification signs at entrances and platforms or boarding areas have some tactile requirements per the requirements in section 810.6.1. Next slide, slide 9. Designation of permanent rooms and spaces. And really, this is the meat of where the tactile requirements are. Most signs that are required to be tactile because they are in some way a designation of a permanent room or space. And again, for the scoping for these is in section 216.2. So these are interior or exterior signs that are identifying permanent rooms and spaces. And these are for designations that are unlikely to change over time. And they include room or floor numbers and letters, room names, and labels for restrooms, locker rooms, cafeterias, libraries, conference rooms, break rooms, mechanical rooms, and areas of refuge, etc. There is an exception to this. Raised and Braille characters are not required on exterior signs not located at the door to the space that they serve. And this exception gets to the idea that, for the most part, signs that are required to be tactile are signs that are located in areas where someone might think to look for them tactilely. For example, near a door. Next slide, slide 10. And as I go through my part of the webinar here, I'm going to be throwing in some common questions that are in our upcoming guide, our upcoming signs guide, as they're relevant to the material that I'm covering. And this will be the first one. Must additional information included on a sign for custodial staff also be tactile? Secondary room numbers or designations intended for custodial or maintenance staff that are provided in addition to general room numbers or names are not required to be tactile, but they must meet the criteria for visual characters. Tactile requirements apply to names or numbers that serve as the main or only designation of a room or space. Next slide, slide 11. And now we'll get into the technical requirements for tactile content. So there are requirements for raised characters, but since many of these requirements are the same as requirements for visual characters, these requirements will be covered when we get to the section on visual characters later in this webinar. There are requirements for grade 2 Braille, requirements for pictograms where provided, and then requirements for the location of these signs at doorways. Next slide, slide 12. And since the raised character requirements will be covered later, we're going to move on to the technical requirements for Braille. So content for raised characters must also be provided in Braille, meeting the requirements in section 703.3, including that they must be in contracted grade 2 Braille, and contracted Braille or grade 2 Braille is basically like a shorthand for Braille, as opposed to having a one-to-one letter correspondence with the print characters. Braille is contracted and more of a shorthand. Okay, the dots must have a domed or rounded shape so that they're easy for somebody to slide their fingers across and not have to encounter any sharp edges. Only the first word of sentences, proper nouns or names, individual letters of the alphabet, initials, and acronyms are to be capitalized in Braille signage. Basically, when in doubt for Braille, do not capitalize. Those things that I just listed are the only things that are to be capitalized for Braille signage. Next slide, slide 13. Positioning of Braille in relation to other sign content. Braille must be located below the corresponding raised character text. If text is multi-lined, Braille must be located below the entire text. However, if there are multiple blocks of text on a sign, then Braille can be located below logical blocks of text of raised characters and not necessarily below all raised characters. For example, if you have a sign on a door where you have a raised character room number and a raised character room name, you could have like raised character number and then Braille number, and raised character name and then Braille name, because the number and the name are two logical blocks of text. But if you have a sign where you just have a name for the room and it just happens to split over two lines in your raised characters, you can't put line 1 of raised characters and then Braille and below that, and then line 2 of raised characters and Braille below that, because the name itself is one block of logical text. So all the Braille must go below all the raised characters. Braille must be separated 3/8 of an inch minimum from any other tactile characters and 3/8 of an inch minimum from raised borders and decorative elements on signs. So in other words, the Braille has to be 3/8 of an inch minimum from any other tactile characters or tactile content on the sign. Next slide, slide 14. Is Unified English Braille acceptable as grade 2 Braille? The Braille Authority of North America made Unified English Braille, or UEB, the official Braille of the United States in 2016. UEB is contracted grade 2 Braille, though it has some differences from the previous English Braille American edition. For the purposes of the ADA standards, UEB is acceptable as grade 2 Braille. Next slide, slide 15. And now we'll move on to requirements for pictograms designating permanent rooms and spaces. These must have a text descriptor directly below the field, the pictogram field, complying with requirements for tactile characters. That would include requirements for raised characters and Braille, and the descriptor must also comply with the requirements for visual characters. The pictogram must have a field height of 6 inches minimum, and no characters or Braille can be in this field. And again, this is for the field height, not for the pictogram height. We do not have a minimum requirement for the pictogram, only for the field that it's in has to be at least 6 inches high. Pictograms and their fields must have a non-glare finish, and pictograms must contrast with their fields with either a light pictogram on a dark field or a dark pictogram on a light field. Pictograms themselves are not required to be raised, only the text descriptors. And the ADA does not require pictograms designating permanent rooms or spaces, but if they are provided, they must comply with these requirements that I just went through. So the ADA doesn't require that little symbol that indicates that your toilet room is a women's room, but if you put it there, then it has to comply with these requirements. Next slide, slide 16. Informational pictograms. I'm going to go through these a little because they differ from the pictograms designating permanent rooms and spaces. Pictograms providing information about a room or space or that are on directional signs are not required to provide the tactile text descriptors or to be located on a field that's at least 6 inches high. Specified accessibility symbols must meet the finish and contrast requirements or criteria, and those will be covered a bit more later in the webinar, but the specified symbols include symbols such as the International Symbol of Accessibility and the International Symbol of TTY. Some examples of informational pictograms that are not required to have that text descriptor or the field. The 6-inch field include the International Symbol of Accessibility, the International Symbol of TTY, pictograms on directional signs, a pictogram that's something like indicating that it's a no cell phone use area, and the biohazard symbol would also be an example of a pictogram that did not have to have the text descriptor or the field. Next slide, slide 17. And moving on to location of signs with tactile content. Tactile characters on signs must be located 48 inches minimum above the finished floor, measured from the baseline of the lowest tactile character, and 60 inches maximum above the finished floor, measured from the baseline of the highest tactile character. At single doors, locate the sign alongside the door at the latch side. At double doors with one active leaf, place the sign on the inactive leaf. At double doors with 2 active leaves, place the sign to the right of the right-hand door. And where there's not sufficient wall space at the latch side of a single door or at the right side of a double door or a door with 2 active leaves, place the sign on the nearest adjacent wall. Signs are permitted on the push side of doors with closers and without hold open devices. Next slide, slide 18. There's a clear floor space requirement. There must be an 18-inch minimum by 18-inch minimum clear floor space centered on the tactile characters of the sign, and it has to be beyond the arc of any door swing between the door's closed position and its 45-degree open position. The space must be free of any protrusions to a height of 80 inches. Next slide, slide 19. And now we're going to get into some questions. We get a lot of questions about the location of these tactile signs. So we have a few to go through here. What constitutes hold open devices? So you can put a sign on the push side of a door if it has a closer, but if it doesn't have a hold open device. So what constitutes that hold open device? Hold open devices are fixed to doors and or walls in order to keep the door in an open position. An example of these would include door stops mounted to doors or wall mounted hooks or similar hardware and magnetic products that keep doors in an open position. Non-fixed devices such as movable door stops, do not constitute hold open devices. So if you have something like one of these fixed devices that's going to keep the door in an open position, obviously you don't want to put a sign on the push side of that door because the door is going to be open and nobody's really going to be able to look for that sign there. But just a movable door stop that you might stick in to hold it open for just a short amount of time does not constitute a hold open device. Next slide, slide 20. Where should tactile signs be placed at doorways without doors? The standards do not specify the location of tactile signs at doorways without doors, but these signs should be located close to the doorway so they are easy to locate by touch. And the location of these signs should be consistent within a facility. So if you place a sign to the right hand of one of these doorways, the next doorway should also have that sign to the right hand so that somebody can know where to look for it and not have to be going back and forth and guessing and maybe just assuming there's not a sign if it's not in that location where they found the first sign. It is advisable to treat doorways without doors in the same way as doors with 2 active leaves, which also do not have a latch side for reference. And just a reminder, where a door has 2 active leaves, the sign must be located to the right of the right door or the right-hand door. Next slide, slide 21. Where are tactile signs to be mounted at doors with a vision panel or side light, or at doors located in glass partitions? Signs may be next to or on vision panels and side lights located on the latch side of doors, as long as the required 18-inch by 18-inch clear floor space can be provided. And just a reminder that you can put the signs on the push side of those doors if the doors have closers and do not have hold open devices. If a door is located in a glass partition, the sign must be mounted on the glass partition except where the signs are permitted to be located on the door itself. So if your door is within a really wide glass partition, you can't just say, well, I'm going to put that sign on the nearest wall, and that wall could be yards away, so that even if somebody found the sign, they wouldn't necessarily know what it was serving. The sign must be mounted on that glass partition. Next slide, slide 22. Can the 18 by 18-inch clear floor space be offset from the wall or sign? And this kind of gets to the idea where we allow the door maneuvering clearance to be offset. So can this clear floor space be offset? The clear floor space can be offset from the wall or sign surface to accommodate limited protrusions, such as base molding. However, other elements or protrusions that offset the clear floor space more significantly are not allowed because they may impede a person's ability to read the sign tactily. And that pretty much covers tactile requirements. And now I will turn it over to my colleague, Josh.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Slide 23. And I'm going to cover the requirements for visual signs. Next slide, 24. So signs that are directional and informational signs are only required to meet the visual requirements for characters, not just, they do not need to meet tactile or raised character requirements. These are signs that provide direction or information about interior space and facilities, and and they must meet the visual requirements, but are not required to be tactile. So an example of informational signs are instructions or rules of conduct or hours of operation. The image that I have here on the left shows an airport terminal with the departure and arrivals directions as an example of a sign that does need to meet visual requirements, but does not need to meet tactile requirements. Next slide, please. Slide 25. So visual characters the requirements are covered in section 703.5. The specifications for visual characters cover the finish and contrast, the case, the style, the character proportion and height, the stroke thickness, and the line and character spacing. Let's move on to the next slide, please. 26. So, separate signs. Where both visual and tactile characters are required, either one sign with both visual and tactile characters, or two separate signs, one with visual and one with tactile characters, shall be provided. The example image that I have to the right is an exit sign for required means of egress. It has the big bright exit sign above the door that needs to be there to be able to see. However, there's still the requirement for there to be a tactile sign. So there's a small exit tactile sign to the right of the door. And this one does not have to meet all of the requirements for visual content. So there's a glare on it. There's not very good contrast between the characters and the background, but that's okay because there is a second sign that does meet those requirements. Let's move on to the next slide, please. 27. So I'm going to go over the requirements for both visual characters and raised characters. So first, I'm going to cover the requirements that are exactly the same for the two. For both visual characters and raised characters, there are prohibited forms. They cannot be italic, oblique, script, highly decorative, or unusual. There are also requirements for character proportions and line spacing that are the same for both visual and raised characters. Slide 28. For character proportions, covered under section 703.2.4 and 703.5.4. So for both visual and raised characters, characters must be selected from fonts where the width of the uppercase letter O is 55% to 110% of the height of the uppercase letter I. And the image below shows a capital letter I next to the letter O that is both stretched and squashed to its maximum and minimum horizontal size based on the height of the letter I that I kind of turned onto the side so that you can see how that is proportional to each other. Next slide, please, 29. And line spacing is also identical between tactile and raised characters or raised characters and visual characters, sorry. 703.2.8 and 703.5.9. Spacing between the baselines of separate lines of characters within a message shall be 135% minimum and 170% maximum of the character height. And the image below shows a family restroom sign and shows that the dimensions of that 135 to 170% is measured from the baseline of the first line to the baseline of the next line. Next slide, please. Slide 30. So there are also overlapping requirements for visual and raised characters. These are ones that if you want to have a single sign, then the requirements are going to have to meet the requirements for both visual and raised, and these requirements are going to apply, these requirements overlap each other. This includes the case, the character spacing, the stroke thickness, the height above finished floor or ground, and the character height. Next slide, please. Slide 31. First, character case. Section 703.2.2 and 703.5.2. For visual characters, the only requirement is that it is a conventional style. You may have uppercase or lowercase, you may have serif fonts, whereas with raised characters, it can only be uppercase letters and sans serif only. To the right, we have an image of men's restroom signs where they have two signs, one that meets the visual requirements and one to meet the tactile requirements. You can see that the one that meets the visual requirements, the words men's restroom, uses lowercase letters, but on the tactile sign, all of those letters are uppercase. So if you're going to have just one sign, it's going to have to be uppercase and sans serif. Next slide, please. 32. And character spacing, section 703.2.7 and 703.5.8. This is going to be measured between the two closest points of adjacent characters, excluding word spaces. For raised characters, the rectangular cross-section characters and the top of beveled characters must be spaced 1/8 of an inch through 4 times the stroke width. If the characters have a bevel to them, the base of the character can be as close together as 1/16 of an inch instead of 1/8 of an inch. By comparison, visual characters need to be between 10% and 35% of the character height. For the raised characters, if you're using those requirements, you are always going to be meeting the visual character requirements, but the visual character requirements are not necessarily going to be meeting the raised character requirements. So if you're only using one sign, make sure you use the raised character requirements. Next slide, 33. Stroke thickness, 703.2.6 and 703.5.7. Raised characters have a stroke thickness based on the uppercase letter I that must be 15% maximum of the character height. Whereas visual characters have a stroke thickness that must be from 10% to 30% of the character height of capital letter I. So if you're going to have just one sign, the stroke thickness has to be between 10% minimum and 15% maximum, so that it can fulfill the requirements for both raised and visual characters. Next slide, 34. The height above finished floor or ground, section 703.4.1 and 703.5.6. As Sarah mentioned before, tactile characters are required to be between 48 inches minimum and 60 inches maximum above the finished floor or ground, measured to the baseline of the lowest tactile character, including Braille. So wherever the baseline of your Braille is, has to be 48 inches minimum. For visual characters, there is a minimum requirement of 40 inches above the finished floor or ground. So if you want to have, again, just one sign meeting both of the requirements, your minimum height is going to be 48 inches. But if you have a just visual sign, or you're using 2 signs to meet the requirements, then the visual characters may be lower. There are exceptions for both tactile and visual characters for elevator car controls, but again, we're not focusing on elevators at this time, more on signage, but I just wanted to let you guys know that there is an exception. Next slide, please, 35. Character height, section 703.2.5 and 703.5.5. So raised characters have a height of 1/2 inch minimum and 2 inches maximum based on the height of the uppercase letter I. Visual characters are going to have a range of heights that it needs to be based on viewing distance. If there is no obstruction between the reader and the sign, then it is a 5/8 inch minimum based on the height of the uppercase letter I. This means that if you are having one sign fulfill both your raised and visual character intents and purposes, it is going to be a minimum of 5/8 inches and a maximum of 2 inches. But if you have separate signs, the raised characters may be as small as 1/2 an inch high instead. Next slide, please, 36. So visual character height, 703.5.5. As I said, this is going to be the character height for raised characters is going to be based on both the horizontal viewing distance and the height of the characters above the finished floor. There is a table in section 703.5.5 that you will need to reference to see the exact minimums and maximums. But the horizontal viewing distance is the distance between the character and an obstruction preventing further approach to the sign. So that means that if there's the edge of a path that you're not supposed to walk on the grass or something, or if there's a physical barrier in front of you that prevents you from getting closer to the sign, that's going to be how the horizontal viewing distance is measured. And then the baseline height above the finished floor is going to be to the bottom of the characters. And so it's going to be the combination of those two things, the horizontal viewing distance and the height, and that is going to determine the height for visual characters. Next slide, please, 36 or 37, sorry. Different requirements for visual and raised characters. So these are requirements that only apply to one or the other. Raised characters need to have a depth of at least 1/32 of an inch minimum raised above the background and must be accompanied by grade 2 Braille. Visual requirements require a non-glare finish and proper contrast. Slide 38, please. Visual finish and contrast, section 703.5.1. Characters must contrast with their background with either light on dark or dark on light and have a non-glare finish. Again, if you want to have one sign as both your visual and raised character requirements, you're going to need to meet the contrast requirements. If they're separate signs, then the raised characters do not need to meet the contrast and finish requirements, but the visual sign does. On the left, we have examples of good contrast where we have some very light tan text over a dark background, or some very dark brown, nearly black text over a very light background. And then we have examples of bad contrast on the right, where it's a gray against a tan color, or basically two different kind of beige-ish colors that makes it very difficult to read from a distance. There's not a minimum level of contrast specified in the standards. It is a judgment call, but the more contrast, the better. And also keep in mind that a varied or textured background can reduce contrast. If your background is going to have a lot of glare or texture or variation, you need to pay extra attention to the amount of contrast that the characters actually provide. Next slide, please, 39. Headroom clearance at overhead signs, section 307.4. When we're talking about visual characters, you can be placing them in locations that you start needing to worry about protruding object requirements. You need to make sure that people are not going to smack into these signs as they're walking around. So if a sign is located above a circulation path, then it needs to provide at least 80 inches minimum of headroom clearance. The image to the right shows another airport terminal and showing that the signs for gate locations and restrooms are meeting only the visual requirements and are above people's heads that they're walking under. And so it needs to be at least 80 inches above the finished floor or ground. Next slide, please, slide 40. And post-mounted signs, section 307.3. We are still talking about protruding objects because sometimes you're going to be mounting these signs on posts. Signs and other objects mounted on posts or pylons that have leading edges of 27 inches to 80 inches high cannot protrude more than 12 inches into circulation paths. The 12 inches limit also applies to the clearance between multiple posts. We do highly recommend that you not protrude more than 4 inches if possible, but if you are going to protrude more than 4 inches, the maximum protrusion is 12 inches, measured from whatever is within cane detection below 27 inches. So on the left, we show a post that has a mount at the bottom. And so the 12 inches are measured to the edge of the sign to that mount at the bottom because that is what is detectable by a cane. The image on the right shows that there's still that 12-inch maximum projection from the post to either side, but that 12-inch maximum requirement also applies to the distance between posts. So you cannot have posts that are more than 12 inches apart unless the leading edge is going to be below 27 inches or above 80 inches. And now I'm going to toss it over to Phil to talk about international symbols of accessibility.
Thanks, Josh and Sarah. You guys provide some great information here about standards and guidelines with signs. We're going to go on to, or I'm going to go on to slide 41, the next slide, and it's titled Symbols of Accessibility. However, I want to say before I begin on symbols of accessibility, I want to mention that while this webinar covers quite a bit on signs, there are still other standards for signs that address other facilities, such as transportation facilities. Due to time constraints, we're not going to go into those in this webinar, but they'll be discussed in the forthcoming signs guide. For now, you can find bus route signs at provision 810.4, rail station signs at 810.6, amusement ride signs at 216.12, and specifically for the ABA, trailhead signs at provision F216.13. Now, onto symbols of accessibility. I'm going to cover 3 required accessibility symbols as addressed in the scoping provisions 216.5 through 216.11. The 3 are the International Symbol of Accessibility, oftentimes referred to as ISA. The second one is the symbol for TTY, or text telephone, which is a phone assistive device for people with hearing or speech impairments. And the third one is the symbol for access for hearing loss, which indicates availability of an assistive listening system. Go on to the next slide, please, which is slide 42. The title of this slide is Symbols of Accessibility, Provision 703.7. The slide shows on the right-hand side 2 graphics of the International Symbol of Accessibility, one with a white icon and black background, and the other with a black icon and a white background. As required by the ADA and ABA standards, these graphics exemplify one of the requirements for symbols that label accessible features and spaces, specifically with symbols contrasting with their background, either light on dark or dark on light. Regarding colors, however, the standards do not specify particular colors or a minimum color contrast level, but you want as striking contrast as possible, which Josh had just previously covered. The ADA and ABA standards also have 2 other general requirements. First, they have to conform to referenced and reprinted international symbols. Second, they must have a non-glare finish, both for the symbol and the background. So, in general, 3 requirements for symbols used to label accessible features and spaces, which are listed in the first set of bullets on this slide on the left-hand side. It is important to note that the standards do not address the size of international symbols of accessibility. Also, verbal content is not required or addressed, except in the case of van accessible parking signs, but can be included. Next slide, please. Slide 43 homes in on the International Symbol of Accessibility, which, as I said, is oftentimes referred to as ISA, which I'll refer to it frequently in this presentation. And it's a long-standing global icon adopted by the International Organization for Standardization. This organization represents 160 national standard-setting entities and develops voluntary, consensus-basis international standards. Various code and standards in the US, including the International Building Code, or IBC, require use of the symbol. The ADA and ABA guidelines and standards reference the symbol, which is a borderless icon of a blue square with a white profile view person in a wheelchair facing to the right. This color combination for the symbol is the most common. Having a uniform iconography promotes legibility, especially for people who have low vision or cognitive disabilities. Next slide, please. Before we discuss the scoping requirements with International Symbol of Accessibility, I want to spend a moment discussing alternatives to the sign, which is slide 44. Where the ADA standards require accessible spaces or elements to be identified specifically by the ISA, or even the other designated international symbols, the sign must be used even if a state or local code or regulation specifies a different symbol. The only way to use another symbol under the ADA standards is if it satisfies the equivalent facilitation provision, which is provision 103. This provision allows alternatives to prescribed requirements only if they result in, quote, substantially equivalent or greater accessibility and usability, unquote. The burden of proof in demonstrating equivalent facilitation rests with the covered entity in the event of a legal challenge. Accessibility labels not required by the standards, such as surface decals at parking spaces, are not required to comply or conform to the ISA. Now, under the Department of Transportation's ADA standards, certain entities responsible for transportation facilities and systems, as well as manufacturers of products and vehicles used in transportation systems, can request a determination of equivalent facilitation from DOT as outlined in its ADA regulations, which are provisions 37.7 and 37.9. This applies only where use of the ISA is required by the standards. On other signs not mandated by the standards, compliance with the specified ISA is not required. The ABA, the Architectural Barriers Act standards, differ slightly with regard to departures in that a waiver or modification is required. The agencies that implement the ABA standards have authority to grant modifications and waivers on a case-by-case basis where, quote, clearly necessary, unquote. Modifications and waivers are rare and are usually considered only in unique circumstances that make compliance with certain provisions exceptionally problematic. The Access Board is responsible for making sure that modifications and waivers are based on findings of fact and are consistent with the ABA. The Access Board has more guidance on the ISA on its website if you'd like to check out more information on its guidance. I'll go to the next slide, please. Slide 45. This slide addresses the scoping for the ISA, which must be used to label or provide direction to a number of elements and spaces. Those elements and spaces are entrances, provision 216.6, toilet rooms and bathing rooms, provisions 213.2 and 216.8, parking, which is provisions 216.5 and 502.6, checkout aisles, which is provision 216.11, and existing compliant elevators, which is provision 216.7. But it is important to note that if all are accessible in these cases, in each of these cases, the ISA is not required. I'm going to go through each of these elements now in a moment. Next slide, please. Slide 46 focuses on entrances, which is provision 216.6. If a facility has inaccessible entrances, the ISA must identify the compliant entrances. At inaccessible entrances, directional signs meeting the visual requirements must be provided to indicate the nearest compliant entrance. If all entrances are accessible, these labels and directional signs are not required. This slide shows two images for directional signs, which can be as simple as the ISA with an arrow, as shown on the left side image. And then the right side image provides additional content. Although it's not required, it can be very helpful. The right side image includes the arrow and the ISA, but it also states use C street entrance. Let's go to the next slide, please. Slide 47 is a recommendation for accessible entrances and directional signs. The image on the left shows a direction sign with the ISA at a fork in the path that leads to two different building entrances. The sign directs individuals to the right side entrance, which is accessible. Our recommendation is that directional signs for accessible entrances should be located to minimize any kind of backtracking. It is recommended that they be placed at the decision points of a route or the beginning of a route to an inaccessible entrance instead of at the entrance. Next slide, please. Slide 48 discusses toilet rooms and bathing rooms, which can be found in provisions 213.2 and 216.8. The image on this slide shows a hallway of clustered single-user toilet rooms, 4 in total, with 2 of them having the ISA. Not to beat a dead horse, but again, if all are accessible, all 4 if they were accessible, which is often the case in new construction, designation by the ISA is not required for toilet rooms and bathing rooms. However, at clustered portable toilets, where at least 5% must comply, and clustered single-user toilet rooms of the same type, where at least 50% comply, the ISA must be used to identify those rooms that are accessible. Again, unless all in a cluster are accessible. With regards to alterations to existing facilities, where existing toilet or bathing rooms do not comply, the ISA must be provided to identify those rooms that are accessible and to provide direction to the nearest compliant toilet or bathing room. Next slide, please. Slide 49. Slide 49 continues discussion on the ISA for toilet and bathing rooms. On the right-hand side is a family restroom sign with Braille below the text, quote, family restroom, unquote, and the ISA to the right of the 3 figures of the pictograms. To be clear, ISA is an informational sign and does not need to meet requirements for pictograms, which is provision 703.6, except for finish contrast criteria. That is, the ISA must meet finish contrast criteria, but not requirements for the field height or text description. Next slide, please. Slide 50, which is titled Checkout Aisles, provision 216.11, shows a graphic of a row of grocery store checkout aisles with the ISA below the identifying aisle number of 2 of them. There's in total, I believe, 6 checkout aisles. 2 of them have the ISA. Compliant checkout aisles must be labeled by the ISA unless all aisles serving the same function are accessible. The sign indicating accessibility must be in the same location as any other signs that identify checkout aisles by number, letter, or function. Next slide, please. Slide 51 homes in on the international symbol of accessibility for parking signs. Found in provisions 216.5 and 502.6, accessible parking spaces must be identified by signs with the ISA that are at least 60 inches high above the finished floor to the bottom of the sign, so that they are visible while vehicles are parked in a space or in spaces. These signs can be on posts, walls, or suspended from ceilings. Although the standards require parking spaces to be identified by the ISA, they do not specifically require one sign for each space. Under the standards, it may be possible to label multiple spaces with a sign so long as it is clear which spaces are designated as accessible. ISA designations on the parking surface, even if required by a state or local government, cannot substitute for above ground signs. State or local codes and regulations may address other sign characteristics, including size, color, and additional content, such as reserved or violation fines, but the ADA standards do not require such characteristics. Signs identifying van spaces must include the term, quote, van accessibility, unquote. This designation is informative and not restrictive in identifying spaces suitable for vans, since such spaces are not limited to only vans. It can be included on the main designation sign or provided on a separate sign. Next slide, please. Slide 52 presents information on parking sign exceptions. Now, parking facilities are subject to only provisions for parking space signs and means of egress. No other sign requirements apply. Exception 1 in provision 216.5 addresses sites with under 5 spaces total. If a total of 4 or fewer, which includes both inaccessible and accessible parking spaces, is provided on a site, the required accessible space must comply but does not have to be identified by a sign. In other words, there needs to be spaces reserved exclusively for use by people with disabilities. The second exception in 216.5 addresses residential facilities. At such facilities, identification of accessible spaces is not required where spaces are assigned to specific dwelling units. Next slide, please. Slide 53 shifts us to another international symbol, specifically the one for TTY, or text telephone, which is a phone assistive device for people with hearing or speech impairments. This symbol must be used to identify TTY equipped phones, including public payphones, in order to provide communication access for people with hearing or speech impairments. Directional signs indicating the location of both the nearest TTY and public payphones in general are also required at payphone banks with TTYs. These directional signs must include the international symbol of TTY and meet visual criteria in the standards. On the right-hand side of the slide is the TTY symbol. Next slide, please. Our final slide on international symbols of accessibility is slide 54, and it discusses the international symbol of access for hearing loss and assistive listening systems. Found in provisions 216.10 and 703.7.2.4, signs with the international symbol of access for hearing loss and compliant with the visual criteria are required to indicate the availability of assistive listening systems in assembly areas. These systems enhance sound signals for people who are hard of hearing and must be provided in assembly areas equipped with audio amplification. Signs can be provided at each assembly area or each ticket office or window. Verbiage on signs is not specified, but is helpful to indicate where assistive listening devices can be acquired. On the right-hand side of this slide is the symbol, which is a profile view of an ear, drawn, and then a solid bar sort of going through it. Next slide, please. And that concludes our presentation on accessible signage. Bill, I'm going to pass the mic back to you for common questions. Actually, Bill, I'm going to moderate the questions. We've got some great questions coming through in the Q&A, probably many more than we're going to be able to address. We also have our pre-submitted questions, which with every webinar, we offer the opportunity for folks to submit questions before for the event. For now, we're going to address both pre-submitted questions and some of those posed in the Q&A. And the first one that we have, I'm going to actually ask Josh if you could respond to this. So the question, and for more context, is there's a design trend that uses large vertical letters, and they're often painted or nailed on vertically on the door or sometimes on the 18-inch wall adjacent to the unit or guest room door, and sometimes on the wall perpendicular to the door in an alcove. The question is, what recommendations do you have for how the signage can be located so that it falls within the visual and tactile ranges?
So there is, excuse me, there is nothing that actually prevents you from doing these vertical numbers. However, that does mean that you are going to have a separate second sign that to meet the raised character requirements that's going to have both the raised characters and the Braille. While the raised characters can be vertically placed, if you want to have just the one sign again for both, the Braille characters do actually need to be read from left to right. So oftentimes, if you want to have big fancy letters for or numbers, digits, characters, whatever, to the side, that's fine, but you will need a second tactile sign with raised characters and Braille to meet the requirements.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks, Josh. This next question relates, and actually, why don't we have Sarah? We had a number of questions, in fact, about the centering of the clear floor space for tactile characters on signs. Could you elaborate on this issue?
Yeah, first I'd just like to reiterate that the 18 by 18 inch clear floor space is required to be centered on the tactile characters of the sign. It's not centered on the sign itself, and it's not centered on the available space that you have for the sign to be mounted. And there's nothing in these requirements that says how close the sign must be to the door. Obviously, it would be great. The closer the sign is to the latch side of the door or to the right side of the door, the better it's going to be. But there's nothing that says that, for example, the center of the tactile characters has to be exactly 9 inches from the latch side of the door. You can basically put that sign anywhere along that wall as long as you can provide that clear floor space. I think it's a bit unfortunate that there's nothing that we don't have a way of saying how close the sign needs to be, because somebody could put it kind of far away from the latch side of the door, or any side of the door for that matter, and still provide that clear floor space, and they wouldn't technically be in violation. But just keep in mind that the closer it is, the better, because that's more likely to be something that somebody who's feeling around looking for a sign, they're more likely to find it if it's actually near the door to the space that it serves.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for that clarification. Our next question, this one's on outdoor recreation and recreation facilities, and we've got our recreation expert, Bill, here. So this question's for you, Bill. Can you discuss the signage requirements for outdoor recreation, such as trailheads, directional signage, viewpoints, interpretive panels, etc.? Can you talk a little bit about the signage requirements?
Thanks, Phil. Well, first, let me say that under the Architectural Barriers Act, there's requirements for trailheads that if they provide signage in a trailhead about a newly constructed or altered trail, or even if the trail doesn't meet the minimum accessibility requirements found in the Architectural Barriers Act for pedestrian trails, it requires that sign provides certain information. And it's listed in the Architectural Barriers Act accessibility guide that we produce that's available from our website. But it talks about some of the key factors. You know, the idea in a pedestrian trail is to understand what the slope may be, what the cross slope, what the surface is made out of. And so there's characteristics of that pedestrian trail facility that the standard requires those elements to be provided. Now, when we look at outdoor signage, the requirements in 7035 that require visual characters to comply apply to permanent rooms or spaces or facilities. And so if you named the outdoor facility, if you had a play area or you had a trail that specifically had a name, and that name is not likely to change over time, that name would be required to comply with the visual requirements. But remember that the requirements for tactile, and remember, tactile is for those raised characters in Braille, are only when it's found at a door, typically, right? Where you're designated permanent rooms or spaces, and you're wayfinding or providing a wayfinding tool for people to understand what that room or space is. And so if the sign is not placed at a door where it serves a space, then there's not a requirement for that sign to provide tactile elements, Braille or raised characters. We find that sometimes in play areas, there's a desire to provide additional information, such as tactile characters, but there's not always a good place to put it. And unless you're providing some type of signage that would be easily located, very descriptive, maybe the requirement for providing tactile characters really wouldn't serve much of a purpose. When we're talking about waysides or informational signs that are providing you information about a large outdoor space, maybe it's a viewing area providing you information about the topography or an animal or a bird or something in the area, I strongly suggest that people look to the professionals that do that on a regular basis. And the National Park Service has a wayside guide available at their website, and it's called the Harper's Ferry Wayside and Exhibit Guide. And I strongly urge you to use that. I also, if you're going to be using these types of signs, I urge you to make sure that you follow some of their guidance on providing a clear space at the sign, providing it at a certain height so that somebody using a mobility device might be able to get up close to it. And also that the route is provided so that everyone can get there and learn that information or enjoy in that opportunity. Bill, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. And thanks for that resource as well as those recommendations. I know that resource is quite useful. So definitely check it out, those in this webinar. And thanks for, clarifying some of the nuances in, let's say, the standards, but also addressing the kind of complex situations that arise moving to outdoor recreation spaces and facilities. So next question, I'm going to throw this one over to you, Sarah. Can you please address recommendations for street signage for organizations and signage on the side of buildings, those that name the building and that do not provide direction?
Okay, so the standards really don't cover this kind of signage, this type of signage. And keep in mind, just a reminder that the standards do not require company names or company logos or building addresses that are on signs to comply with these requirements. That's actually content that is not required to comply with our sign requirements. So in general, those signs just aren't covered. And that's basically the short answer to that question. Before we go on, Phil, I would like to just address something that I think there might have been some confusion in a slide, my slide on required compliance of signs.
Mm-hmm.
And at the first part of that, the first bullet point on that slide was that we're not all, we have requirements where signage is actually required to be provided in the ADA if not all elements and spaces are accessible. And I included in that list parking. And that's because in general, I mean, I have plenty of friends with disabilities who probably wish that all parking was accessible, but unfortunately it's not. So since not all parking is generally accessible, those parking spaces do have to, the accessible ones must be identified. However, unlike for restrooms, where if all restrooms are accessible, you don't have to identify them as accessible. With parking, even if all the parking spaces are accessible, you still need to comply with the requirements for identifying the accessible spaces in 502.6. I just wanted to clarify that I did not intend to say that if all parking spaces are accessible, then they don't have to be identified. And of course, then there's that other exception that Phil mentioned, that if there's only 4 parking spaces in accessible or not accessible, then none of them have to be identified. So just if you're looking at parking, obviously you need to go to 502.6.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, for clarifying that. And as well as the recommendations with with signs that name the building and that do not provide direction. And just to reiterate, the standards, is the minimum requirements. It's always good practice to go beyond the minimum if possible, when possible. So just something to keep in mind. Got another question. This one's going to be about Braille, and I'm going to call on you, Sarah, since you are so knowledgeable about Braille. The question, and we had a few about dot size and spacing. Could you talk about some of these requirements, Sarah? The dot size and spacing?
Yeah. So there are very specific requirements for the Braille dot size and the spacing, and these are in table 703.3.1 of the standards. So whatever sign company or whoever's providing Braille content on your signs, they really are just going to have to look at those requirements and make their Braille according to those dimensions, to the dot size, to the spacing between dots, to the spacing between Braille cells, to the spacing between lines. They're just going to have to look at that and make sure that their dots are measuring up to those requirements. And, you know, Braille dots are basically small. We don't really go for jumbo Braille, which is larger Braille, because that's actually difficult to read. It's not that easy to read. So whatever sign companies do in your signage, they need to be following those standards and having the signs that comply with those measurements. Okay, so the dots, we also got some questions about the shape of dots. So the dots must have a domed or rounded shape. So dots with sharp edges are not permitted. So having Braille where the top of the dome has been shaved off and you've just kind of got a flat surface and then edges around it, that's not compliant. We really don't want sharp edges because that makes it difficult or even uncomfortable for somebody to try to read, to slide their hands across easily. Okay, we also got some questions in there about the type of method, the way that Braille could be provided. The standards really don't have a specific method for how you provide the Braille. So one of the methods that's used is where they make little holes in the sign and then they inset the little dots into those holes. There's nothing that prohibits making Braille that way, but you do have to make sure, or whoever's doing it has to make sure that those dots are really well glued in and can stand up to people running their fingers across them and not fall out. I have seen examples where these dots really do fall out. And interestingly, though, I've not seen them so much on door labels, but on where people are trying to be nice and have a wayside that's in Braille, like the waysides that Bill was just talking about. They make those in Braille sometimes, and they use that method, and their dots are just missing all over the place, and it's not readable. I would just like to urge any of you who are having Braille signs with Braille content to please have somebody who can read Braille tactilely proofread them. I don't even know if the sign companies have people doing that, but I have seen so many examples of signs where I'm blind, by the way, so I read these Braille signs, and I have found so many examples where the spacing is just wrong. I mean, not just wrong because it doesn't meet our measurement criteria, but wrong because the letters are practically on top of each other and there's no spacing at all. So please, when you're getting this signage done, try to make sure that they have somebody that's actually doing some tactile proofing.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, wonderful points there. Many wonderful points. Going to move on to the next question, which I'm going to ask one more from you, Sarah. So the question is, do tactile signs require an 18-inch by 18-inch clear floor space centered on the sign on the push side of doors or just on the pull side as shown in figure 703.4.2 in the guidelines?
Okay, so the 18 by 18-inch clear floor space in front of these Braille signs is required regardless of where the sign is. Obviously, if the sign is on the push side of a door, the requirements about the sign not being in the arc of the door swing do not comply because the door is not swinging out. You don't have to worry about that door swinging out and hitting somebody while they're trying to read that sign. I would just point out that if you're going to have the sign on the push side of the door, it's good if that clear floor space, that 18 by 18-inch clear floor space, can be completely in front of the door. Technically, it probably could, overlap the door and the wall, but it really shouldn't if the door is recessed. Because as we said, and as I said in one of my slides, the 18 by 18-inch clear floor space really cannot be offset from the door much. We say that it can be offset to accommodate something as limited as base molding. or the baseboards.
Mhm.
But if you have a door that's recessed and you have that clear floor space kind of straddling the door and the wall that the door is inset into, and that door is recessed, then you're basically offsetting that clear floor space too much, and it might be difficult for somebody to have to reach in there and try to read the sign.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks. Next question. We'll give you a break, Sarah. Josh, I'm going to ask you a question that came through some of our pre-submitted questions. Do the large 12-inch by 18-inch stairway identification signs required by the International Building Code for interior exit stairways, do those signs have to comply with visual character requirements as noted in 703.5 for those visual requirements?
Absolutely. It's even explicit in 216.4.1 for exit doors, where we say that doors at exit passageways, exit discharge, and exit stairways shall be identified by tactile signs that comply with 703.1, 703.2, and 703.5. 703.2 is going to cover both your raised and Braille, and 703.5 is going to cover your visual characters. So yes, any of those signs that are located at exit stairways need to meet both visual and tactile requirements.
Great, thanks. Next question actually deals with digital signage, and we got a few in the Q&A during the live webinar as well. So hopefully this question and the answer can address a number of other questions. So the question is, how do you make digital signage accessible, such as in office lobbies, building entrances, restaurant dining areas? And I'm going to go ahead and answer this one. So accessible digital signage, electronic signs that stream or scroll content, and they're also known as variable message signs. They do pose unique accessibility considerations. New, quote, talking sign technologies, and some of those are like remote infrared audible sign systems. They provide additional means of making sign content accessible. Now, the ADA standards do not address these technologies. However, recent editions of the ICC A117.1 accessibility standard, which is referenced by the IBC or the International Building Code, they provide specifications on variable message signs and remote infrared audible signs. You'd want to check out provision 703.7 and 703.8 in the 2009 and 2017 editions. Hopefully that helps answer some questions about digital signage. Our next question, I'm going to bounce over to Sarah, if you don't mind. So this question asks, if a sign repeats information in another language, do those characters have to comply as well, just as the ones in English have to?
Okay, so if a sign is written in more than one language, only the English content must comply with these requirements. So if you have a sign that has English and another language, only the English has to comply. If a sign is only written in a language other than English, that sign must comply to the maximum extent feasible with these requirements. So obviously this is with the understanding that the standards do not have or do not address requirements for character sets or Braille in languages other than English. So, you know, we can't really say that if you're providing Braille in a sign, if you have a sign that's in a different language, that Braille has to be contracted. Some languages don't even have contracted Braille. And we can't necessarily say that the requirements that we have for something like stroke thickness or whatever for our English alphabet font requirements would be the best requirements to make something that's using like Arabic characters or Chinese characters more visually accessible. So, you know, you just do the best you can. The signs could still be mounted at the right height, and they can still meet finishing contrast requirements, but, you know, just do the best you can with that understanding that there just aren't requirements in the standard for these other character sets.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Good point. Let's move on to the next question. I'm going to throw this one over to Bill because it deals with assembly areas. And Bill, even prior to working at the Access Board, has worked in areas of assembly areas, as well as definitely visited many. So here's a question about assembly areas, Bill. If an assisted listening device system is provided in an assembly area, does that sign need to be tactile and Braille?
Thanks, Phil. First, let's just remind everybody that remember where you use audible amplification in an assembly area, you would be required to provide an assistive listening system. And in order to provide that assistive listening system, you also have to provide signs informing patrons of the availability of that system. Okay, those assistive listening systems have to comply with the visual character requirements that are found in 703.5. And that includes that international symbol for access for hearing loss. And you can find that specific symbol in 703.7.2.4. So no requirement for tactile and Braille, okay, but visual requirements apply.
Okay, great. I got one more for you, Bill. And this one is sort of a collection of a number of questions about particular facilities, elements, and spaces or rooms, actually. Do you have pictogram recommendations for adult changing tables, bariatric accessible rooms, or gender neutral toilet rooms? What about some pictogram recommendations?
This is always a really good question because the design community advances faster than these standards do, and there haven't been requirements for these type of pictograms in the standard. And a lot of these different features or spaces are evolving. But I would recommend that if you're looking to provide these unique type of spaces or these special facilities, that you make sure that you work with the organizations or the groups that advocate for this, the changing spaces for the adult changing tables. Advocate or go to them to see what they're advocating the symbol should be. We've seen lots of different variations for the gender neutral and also the adult changing tables. I would recommend that the facility, be consistent, that don't mix up your signs. If you're going to use a specific sign for a unique feature, that you be consistent throughout your facility. So I guess my recommendation is, well, first, there is not a specific pictogram for these unique types of facilities or elements. And that by following those groups that advocate on behalf of these special facilities, elements, or spaces, using the one that they recommend, but also being consistent throughout your facility so people understand what the symbol means.
Could
Thanks,
I make
Bill.
a comment on that, Bill?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead, sir.
Okay, I was just going to say that just a reminder that, like, let's say you do decide to use a pictogram to designate a neutral gender toilet room or to indicate a toilet room that's accessible for people with bariatric issues. You can, we do not require those pictograms, but if you do use them to designate that room or space, then they do need to have the text descriptor and the field height. But otherwise, we don't require them, and we certainly don't tell you what pictogram you have to use. So that's when you can just, go to some of those resources that Bill said if you decide you really do want to use it and find out what the best one might be. But just a reminder that we don't require them, but if you do use them to designate a permanent room or space, they do have to have the text descriptor and the 6-inch field height.
Thank you, Sarah. That's very important to remember.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I really appreciate you, Bill, mentioning, the value of having consistency as a recommendation. And we see that in a number of areas in the standards, not just with signs, but the consistency goes a ways. So thank you to you both. We've got time. I want to ask one more question, particularly about parking signs. just because there's always a lot of questions about parking signs. And Josh, I'm going to throw this one to you. Is there a location requirement for parking signs? That is like distance behind the back of the space. You know what I mean?
Yep. I'll answer that in a few more questions that we got coming in about parking signs. So one, there is no definitive location of where the parking sign must be. In fact, there doesn't even need to be an accessible parking sign for each accessible space, as long as the signage that is provided marks which spaces are accessible. So you could have a range of spaces, and if you were to put signs saying spaces between here and here are accessible, that is okay. You don't need to have one at each individual spaces, even though some sort of signage is going to be required. So no, there's not really a location requirement. You don't even need to have one at each space, but you do need to think about how you are going to make sure that these signs do identify the space.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then on top of that, I'm going to add that we had questions about the height of the van accessible sign on parking spaces for parking signs. Yes, that van accessible sign does need to be at least 60 inches off the floor or ground. Everything, all the signage that you are using to indicate parking has to be at least 60 inches off of the ground. Also,
this is Bill. I was just going to jump in there, Josh, and just say that in those parking requirements, there may be additional requirements by state or local authorities that could trigger additional signage or other signage.
Oh, absolutely. Just like I know California has specific colors that you need to use to mark your access aisle or your symbol of accessibility. That's a California requirement. We don't have any colors that we tell you to use. I do also want to say that if there is a symbol on the ground, you still do need a posted sign. A symbol on the ground marking space as an accessible space is not good enough. You do need to have an actual sign out there. And finally, we got a lot of questions involving the active/dynamic symbol of accessibility with a person leaning forward in their wheelchair. That is not technically something that we say is okay in the ADA or ABA. Now, if you want to use it, then it is going to basically be up to you to prove that it is providing equivalent or better accessibility and understanding of what it is implying. So that if you have some person who's going to go all out and say this needs to be the actual ISA, the actual International Symbol of Accessibility, they're right, and it's going to be on you to prove it under equivalent facilitation for the ADA. But if this is federal and it's ABA, I just say don't use it, because you're going to need to get a waiver to say that you can use something different. And that is a whole process that would be very difficult to get everyone to sign off on, to say that, yes, you can use this symbol that is not the ISA.
Thanks, Josh.
I think that's it for parking.
Yeah, no, that cleared up. You just addressed more than two handful of questions in the Q&A as well as pre-submitted. So thanks a lot for all those points. We are out of time. I'm going to pass it back over to Bill to just close out a couple of slides that will finish up this webinar. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Phil and Sarah and Josh, for your comprehensive overview. When I think about the accessible signage issues that we've just gone over, they've always been a challenge for me, and working with the standards and understanding them. And I think this webinar will bring you one step closer, as well as some of the other materials we're going to talk about here in just a few minutes. So at this time, we're going to take your questions. Okay, that's all the time we have. If we could move on to the next slide, slide number 56. I want to thank everybody for participating in today's webinar. And I'm sure you have additional questions that either we didn't get to that were asked during this session, or that you want to reach out to the Access Board for clarification on. We have a couple different ways you can do that. The first would be calling our technical assistance hotline at 1-800-872-2253. That's our voice line, 800-993-2822 is our TTY. We're available from 10 to 5 Eastern Standard Time, Monday through Friday, except for Wednesdays. We're only live until 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We also have the option for you to leave us a voicemail message, so that if we are closed and you're thinking about one of the issues that we've either addressed now or in the standards, we'd be happy to answer it the next business day if you leave us your contact information in a voicemail. Even on the weekend, you can leave us a voicemail any time of the day. We'll be happy to return your call and answer your question. We also have an opportunity where you can reach out to us by email. And our email for technical assistance is ta@access-board.gov. And the resources that we've been talking about throughout this presentation are available at the Access Board's website. We're hoping that you already know this and use it as a resource in your daily business, or as a resource in trying to determine compliance. Our website is www.access-board.gov. If I could move on to the next slide. I want to remind everybody that this webinar, Accessible Signage, was available for continuing education, and that course number and date are provided on this slide number 57. Moving on to the next slide. Slide number 58. Again, I want to thank everybody for participating in today's webinar. It's been our pleasure to be with you, speak to you about accessible signage and the importance it provides for making sure that people understand where accessible features are and elements and spaces, how to access your services that are accessible. We're hoping that in your new construction and alterations, you do the best job you can, or even exceed the minimums that we've been talking about here today on making your place more universally accessible to everyone. I also want to remind you that at the post after this webinar is over, you have an opportunity to give us an evaluation. Tell us what you think. Tell us what maybe the next session that you'd like to hear about is. We take those evaluations very seriously, and we're hoping that you will participate and provide us with your feedback. Next, I'd like to highlight our next session, Accessible Swimming Pools and Spas. It'll be held on March 3rd, 2022. Again, that'll be the first Thursday of the month of March. Also on this slide is a way to reach accessibility online. If you have issues with your registration or any of the issues with this webinar, you can also reach out to accessibilityonline.org or reach them by phone at 877-232-1990, voice or TTY. Again, thank you for participating in today's webinar.
This concludes today's session. At this time, you can close your browser by either shutting down your browser and/or using the leave option in the lower right-hand corner, or whatever is on the device that you're using, phone or mobile device. Thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.